Order, order. Can I welcome everyone to the sitting of the Home Affairs Select Committee and our ongoing inquiry into the impact of Brexit on policing and security. Can I welcome our witnesses today, and could I just ask you to introduce yourselves and explain your responsibilities in this area? DAC Martin.
Good morning, yes. DAC Richard Martin. I'm a Metropolitan Police Deputy Assistant Commissioner. At the moment, I'm leading for the National Police Chiefs Council on Brexit, and particularly around EU tools and powers, and I head up the newly formed International Crime Coordination Centre.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Steve Rodhouse. I'm from the National Crime Agency. I'm the Director General for Operations, so I work directly to Lynn Owens and lead the NCA's operational footprint. I also lead the NCA's preparations for EU exit.
Thank you very much. We've obviously taken considerable evidence on this before and previously been told that there is a significant reduction in security and policing capability in the event of no deal, and it's those no deal preparations that we would like to explore with you today. Could you give us a very brief just summary of your current assessment of the preparedness for no deal and the areas in which those gaps will remain? DAC Martin.
Yeah, sure. Obviously, since the last time I came before you, the International Crime Coordination Centre has been set up. That is a unit that comprises three main elements, and that's gauged to make sure that policing is as fit as it possibly can be for the challenges that are coming ahead. So we have a central unit that sits in London that's there to provide 24/7 advice and guidance to all police officers around all of the current EU instruments and, of course, those contingency plans that will fall back behind them in the event of a no deal or in the event that we don't have those as we move forward. We have a series of officers across the whole of the country that are working with forces individually, and their role is to sit around all sort of things such as tasking meetings, really critical areas for policing, again to promote the use of EU tools and to do some of the preparatory work that we're doing at the moment around things that we call back record converting. So that's putting current SIS notices onto Interpol notices to make sure that any of the worst case scenarios that happen, we won't lose sight of some of those tools and some of those alerts that we currently have. And we've also trained 300 tactical advisors across all areas of policing within forces. And again, their role is to educate and communicate and make sure that all officers are making the most use of EU tools. In addition to that, we've trained over 7,500 people across the UK. Again, those are in critical roles within policing, and behind that sits a massive communications programme that brings to the awareness of officers around how they go about using tools. There's lots more I could tell you, but I know you want me to keep it brief.
Mr Rodhouse.
Thank you. So, as you've heard, a huge amount of work has been going on right across law enforcement to prepare for EU exit. I am confident that we are as prepared as we can be to transition to the alternative arrangements that we'll be using after EU exit. Richard has outlined some of that work. In addition, sort of from a National Crime Agency perspective, we have recruited significant numbers of staff to help us transition to using tools such as the Interpol I-24/7 system more frequently in the absence of the SIS2 system. We have also recruited numbers of international liaison officers to be deployed bilaterally across Europe if we are not able to operate within Europol. I think it's important to say that despite this, I think, really excellent work actually to prepare ourselves to work on these alternative arrangements, it is fair to say that these alternative arrangements are not like-for-like powers, and there are some areas where our capability will be not what it currently is. I'm very happy to talk about those individually if you wish.
That would be helpful if you just maybe go into some of the individual areas. So the previous evidence we'd had, I think Neil Basu, has also said in August that there isn't a contingency planning for not being given passenger name records, that there isn't a replacement for having the passenger name records. Is that correct?
So passenger name records is something we use operationally. In this forum, I wouldn't want to go into too much detail about the operational benefit it gives us. Suffice to say, it is a tool that we use on a daily basis to progress our investigations. It is right to say there is not a like-for-like replacement. It isn't a power that the National Crime Agency delivers or leads upon, so I wouldn't want to mislead you in that respect. It is the case that we will continue to get advance notice of passenger travel, which is an important element, but it is not the complete tool that PNR gives us. And so that is an area where we are really keen for government to make progress.
Do you see, Martin?
Nothing really to add. I think Steve's absolutely right. It's something that's really critical. It's something we use that isn't a direct alternative at the moment, and I know the Home Office are trying to work on how that might look in the future.
Okay. And similarly, the SIS2.
Yeah. So, as a reminder, maybe for members, SIS2 is a Europe, an EU-wide, Schengen-wide, indeed, system that delivers alerts right to the point of operational contact, so right to the front line in the UK. So when colleagues check the Police National Computer, they check the SIS2 system, and therefore they can become aware of alerts put on right across the EU. That's really significant. We will not have access to SIS2 when we leave the EU. In order to mitigate that, significant work has been done to try and replicate some of that functionality by greater use of the I-24/7 system, the Interpol system of alerts. So 100, in the region of 125,000 current Interpol alerts have now been uploaded onto the Police National Computer, so they will be available to be checked at the point of operational activity. And a system has been put in place so that new Interpol alerts will be available through the Police National Computer. That's important, but it's not a complete mitigation
What's
of
the
that
comparison
risk.
of scale? How many Interpol alerts are there compared to SIS alerts?
It is tricky to give a direct comparison, but it is fair to say there are more SIS2 alerts than there are Interpol alerts, and it's a really important point to say that whilst we in the UK have the opportunity to back record convert, if you like, existing Interpol alerts onto PNC, and we have engaged significantly across Europe, the challenge remains that SIS2 alerts that have been put on by other EU member states, unless they have been parallel inserted into the I-24/7 system, we will not have access to them after the 31st of October. And that's quite important.
And that's why I think we do need to have some sense of scale here. So, for example, are most European countries putting half of their SIS alerts onto the I-24? Are they putting a quarter? Are they putting 90% of their alerts onto I-24?
Perhaps I could just help with some of those figures. So there are about 82 million alerts on SIS across the EU member states. Of those, there are nearly 3 million UK alerts that we have on that system. So they will be for a range of things, from people that are missing, items that are missing, people that are wanted on European arrest warrants, etc.
And that's alerts, those are points that the UK has uploaded some information about a stolen vehicle or about a missing person.
Yeah, or we've put an alert on, we want to know something about somebody, we want to kind of track them. We checked SIS last year 603 million times. That's because obviously part of the requirement to have SIS as a member state is that it's linked into your national system. So as Steve was saying earlier on, it's linked into the Police National Computer. At the moment, if an officer puts somebody on that's missing, and we have probably about 200,000 people go missing in this country a year, on and off, some for days, some for hours, some for a lot much longer, they automatically go onto the system. So the workarounds we've had to do around that is to look at how do we do that, because to put it onto I-24/7, which is the Interpol system, is a manual system. So we've been working with Steve's teams really hard to look at how can we try to semi-automate some of that work, because of course for everything you do manually, that has an impact on an officer, on their time and on the ability and the speed for us to do something with.
Okay, so this is about quantity of information on there and also about speed of access.
Yes.
And again, just on quantity of information on the I-24 system compared to what you said on the SIS system?
I don't have the exact figures. I could get those for you, but my colleagues, when we were talking yesterday, said it's more about probably in the hundreds of thousands than it is the amount that we have. Okay. And that's because, of course, we use SIS. We don't use...
But do you mean hundreds of thousands of UK alerts compared to the 3 million, or hundreds of thousands of in total alerts compared to the 82 million?
In total alerts.
Compared to the 82 million?
Yeah, from us, from a UK point of view.
But So that 82 million is for the whole of the EU,
Yes.
but we presumably, it's in our interest to know if France or Italy or another country has put an alert on someone who may be dangerous, involved in criminal activity.
And some will. There's a real mixture. Some countries will already what we call double key. They will put them onto Interpol at the same time as they put them onto SIS. Some don't. It's quite a mixed picture across Europe, and some of the work the teams have been doing with the Home Office is just to get countries into the thinking about, okay, if we don't have SIS in the future, we cannot help you unless you've put them onto the Interpol system, because we will not see them, and vice versa.
Okay, so ballpark, if there are 82 alerts on SIS and 3 million of them come from us, so therefore 79, we have access at the moment to 79 million pieces of criminal intelligence from other countries that may or may not be relevant or significant in any work that a police officer is doing. Compared to that 79 million pieces of criminal intelligence, how many will we have access to on the I-24 system?
I would have to go back and have a look at it. It will be less.
But scale of less. Are we talking about hundreds of thousands compared to 79 million?
Yes.
Okay, so that is a massive reduction. It's not just less, that is hugely less.
Yes.
Can you give me an example of the kind of case that you would currently pick up using the SIS system, where you might have an alert from another country, for example, that we would be reliant on the I-24 system maybe or maybe not having that information?
Yeah, so somebody who is wanted, let's say a country overseas has put somebody on their system as wanted, or we've put somebody on that's wanted on a European arrest warrant, so for anything from murder to theft to burglary to robbery for a criminal offence. At the moment, if they are on a European arrest warrant, they are automatically put onto the SIS alert. So an officer on the street stops somebody on the street and says, this person is wanted in Poland for, let's say, burglary. Then the officer there and then can arrest that individual, take them into custody, and then the extradition process will occur. They will go back, and vice versa if somebody overseas has arrested somebody that we have an interest in. If we no longer have SIS, and we no longer have the European arrest warrant, the fallback is they will create what is called a red notice. So a red notice on Interpol says they are wanted in connection with a criminal offence. If we don't know that the individual is coming, and again the same scenario, an officer stops that person on the street and they're wanted on a red notice, we know they're wanted for arrest, but there is no current power of arrest for that in UK legislation. I'm
going to pause here because we want to come back to the arrest warrants in a second. So just continuing then, and just in terms of the data, how many times are SIS alerts from other countries used? So
as in that we arrest on them?
Maybe arrest, or maybe just use bits of intelligence and so on. How many times a year? Do you have a figure for how many times that 82 million pieces of information might be used? I have figures for us in relation to arrest warrants, which obviously SIS alerts. So we probably average between 1,400 and 1,500 arrests on European arrest warrants a year on SIS. We do it on an 8-to-1 ratio at the moment, so every 9 people that are arrested, 8 of those we are arresting on behalf of partners from member states. So those are people that are wanted for criminal offences that we can then extradite from this country back to face justice over there. And for every 1 they arrest, we bring somebody back here. So for that bit, I have the figures. For the rest, we probably have to get that for you. But certainly because it's so easy, because they're all integrated with everybody's national system, it obviously makes it much easier for officers on the ground particularly, especially if you're not in a pre-prepared operation. You know, if you're pre-planning an operation, there's a lot of preparatory work, a lot of preparedness in that you can do. But obviously if somebody's presented in front of you, you were doing something like a discrete alert or a discrete check for somebody, then you need that information to hand straight away. So this makes it more difficult to stop criminals from overseas? Yes. Kate Green.
May I just pursue a little further the data that is available through the SIS alerts in relation to children, missing children, child protection? Are you able to give us a sense of the scale of children-related cases and where SIS alert data is used?
I can give you the general missing person piece, I think, is what I quoted earlier on, which is there are about 200,000 missing people, that includes children, that go missing per year. And as soon as an officer puts that person on our police national computer as a missing person, irrespective of whether you think they're going overseas or not, that automatically uploads the SIS. So that means 27 member states can see that child or that other has gone missing, and then can therefore take some action if that comes across.
And what will happen in the event of no deal after the end of October to alerts that are put on our national system? I'm thinking particularly, for example, where you have family law disputes and child abduction is part of the picture.
So if it's a missing person, some of the work we've been doing at the moment is we would have to manually put alert onto the Interpol system. It's a different notice, but it's the same thing. It says somebody is wanted missing. The difference is, of course, you would have to differentiate between whether you think that person is going to go overseas or not. At the moment, we don't need to worry about that bit because obviously it's automatic. So a lot of the work we're doing, because the quantity is so vast, 200,000 people coming on, going off, sometimes for a long time. So what my team have been doing with Steve's team in the NTA is looking at how we can start to semi-automate that for forces, so that we are trying to take out that risk factor from the officer on the ground making a decision, that actually we can make sure that alert goes as far and as wide as we possibly can, so that we can make a reasonable intervention.
And how far forward are you with that work?
We've just completed a pilot. We're about to put 2,000 missing people on from that pilot. So it's going to go live in the next month or so. We think it's worked. It's been a lot of hard work to do because obviously these are computer systems. But we think we've put ourselves in a much better place. And I guess that's what that few months of gift we've been given between the 29th of March and now has allowed us to do. It's just allowed us to try and tighten up some of those capabilities. So Steve gave you a very high level overview just now about some of these fallbacks are not as good as they are. What we're trying to do is trying to close that gap as much as we possibly can.
Would you be able to later come back to us with details about exactly how many children, missing children, are involved in what we've been discussing?
Of course.
And the sharing of child abuse imagery often involves an international network, and it can sometimes be the case that an offender is outside the UK but presenting a threat to children in the UK. In the event of no deal, do you have concerns that we'd no longer potentially be able to participate in pan-European cooperation protocols to enable such information to be shared swiftly? And if so, what are we doing about that?
So the idea, the concept of information sharing across pan-Europe is critical. Largely we do that through Europol as an agency at the moment. So frankly, our ability to share en masse with Europol depends on the status we have with Europol. We are confident we will still, however, be able to share data with individual nations and groups of nations, but not necessarily through Europol unless the appropriate operational agreements are in place.
And how long do you think it might take to negotiate those?
I have to say I'm not well placed to speculate on how long it would take. As it stands at the moment, leaving the EU on the 31st of October, for instance, unless there is a working arrangement, then we will cease all information exchange with Europol. That's not quite the same as not with individual states on a bilateral basis. We would hope, we would be very keen to see a quick working arrangement and a quick operational agreement that would follow that, but that's not something that I'm able to influence.
Are you able to say, when you say quick, whether you mean weeks, months?
It's not something that I have any influence on. I would like to see it as quickly as possible, within days. It's not something we are, from an NCA perspective, able to influence at this point.
Who has the influence? Is that the Home Office?
Well, it's a government, government negotiations along with the Commission.
Do you know what they're doing to advance those discussions, or is any discussion taking place at the moment, to your knowledge?
My challenge here is I don't want to mislead members at all in any respect on this. My understanding is that it requires negotiation with the Commission, and that as of yet that's not been possible.
So potentially no discussion is taking place right now.
Just to add, really, to carry on from what Steve's saying, one of the things you can do if you are having an operation that concerns things like child sexual exploitation and images, joint investigation teams, which we currently have under Eurojust, under the banner of Eurojust, we can continue to do those. We can continue to do those under the 1959 Convention. So if you had a number of European countries that were having offenders that were sharing across police, we could still operate with those on an operational basis.
And it's fair to say that in relation to joint investigation teams, the existing joint investigation teams have now all been transitioned to the alternative arrangement, so we anticipate continuity of those going forward.
Okay. This is funny.
JC Martin, you referred to the European arrest warrant, so I think we'd turn to that now. Douglas Ross.
Could you just go back to, I think you were explaining things about the chair wanted to confine your remarks at that point. So just explain further what will happen with European arrest warrants if we leave without a deal on the 31st of October, and how that will work with other countries.
Sure. So For anybody in the system, and by that I mean in custody at the moment, who has been arrested on a European arrest warrant but hasn't yet been extradited, there's been a statutory instrument that was laid, I think, in June of this year, which means we can continue to deal with those. So they won't be released. We can continue to deal with those individuals, and they will be extradited back to the country where they were originated from.
So just on that, how long potentially after the 31st of October could that still be happening?
It's a statutory instrument, so anybody that's been arrested prior.
Yeah, no, I understand that. But say they're arrested on the 31st of October, could they still be going through the system in December, January?
Possibly.
Yeah, so
there's no time limit.
There's no time limit. You're not in a rush to do anything with it.
As long as you've not been arrested on the 1st of November, that's where it changes.
Okay.
For the others, so those for European arrest warrants that we currently have, but we haven't arrested anybody on, we have to convert those to red notices and put them on Interpol. So they would then be dealt with when they're arrested post the 31st of October under the 1957 Convention Act, so under Extradition Act. And the same for other countries. So if they have people that they want us to arrest on their behalf post the 31st of October, if that's when we leave without a deal, then again it would come down to the Convention of Europe on 1957 and extradition.
And with the 1957 Convention, how much more difficult or complex is it going to be, therefore, from the 1st of November rather than the 31st of October?
It's certainly slow.
Can you give us examples of what you will have to do from the 1st of November that you wouldn't have had to do on the 31st of October if we leave without a deal?
Yeah, so for everybody that we want to arrest, or somebody wants us to arrest, we would have to go to Westminster Magistrates and get a warrant.
And that's the only court in the country that does that?
Yeah, that's currently the only country, So instead of having a power of arrest directly, we'd have to go and get a warrant. What that means is if we have an advance notice of somebody coming to this country who's wanted, we can quickly go off and get a warrant and then hope to intervene as they land. If we don't know they're here, and again, sort of the example I gave earlier on, that somebody's presented to you as an officer, you don't know, but you find out on the Interpol system they're wanted, then unless you have a different power of arrest to detain them, you can't detain them until you've gone and get a warrant. So the risk is, of course, you've got somebody in front of you for a serious offence. There's no other grounds for you to arrest that individual, then you can't stop them.
And how does the alert system work? So you've spoken about what happens when you arrest someone, but how much more complicated potentially will it be to get that information to other countries and for other countries to get that information to the UK?
It's complicated in the way that it's a manual system, so it's not linked directly to your system, so there is a time delay for a start. You've then got to fill out a form that's accepted by the NCA Bureau, which then goes on to Interpol. So you're manually filling these things out as opposed to them going on automatically. So that obviously builds in part of a delay for you. And of course, you've got to be conscious that they're going overseas as well for you to be able to put that on. So it's a bit of a time lag. It's a manual system, and you've got to make sure, hope that all of our European partners will be looking at the Interpol system. If you turn that on its head, instead of us checking one system at the moment, so again, your police officer scenario checks the police national computer in the UK, that would automatically tell them where they're wanted overseas. That officer has to remember that not only do they need to check the PNC in the future, they would have to ask for an Interpol check at the same time. So it's having to make sure that busy people understand there are now two different systems they've got to kind of check rather than one.
It may be helpful if I just come in at this point. So I wouldn't want to mislead the committee here. So it is absolutely right, it is a manual process, but we are introducing automation which speeds up the process. So I wouldn't want to give the impression there is a significant time lag between an EU member state putting an Interpol red notice onto I-24/7 and that being transitioned and updated onto the police national computer. That is a matter of hours, same-day process, because we are investing and have invested in the UK International Criminality Bureau to make sure that we are as slick and as effective as possible, because clearly it would be highly risky to have a backlog of cases where there were red notices available that were not known to operational officers. So that transition is being done very swiftly.
Just two final points. Is potentially the biggest blockage then going to be the Magistrates' Court? How worried are you? How well prepared are they to deal with potentially a large number of cases coming to them to be seen that previously they hadn't?
I don't know is the answer. I don't know how their preparations are going, but I think it's clear to say, of course, if there is suddenly 1,500 cases that you're now asking for a warrant on, where we probably averaged about 40 to 50 extraditions before that under the old Act, then there is a volume and a demand place that will be placed upon them.
But finally, from me, you would say, would you say that you are confident you have done enough to prepare for this? That measures are in place. You know what you have to do. You will minimise time lags as much as possible. And ultimately, if we do leave without a deal, there are still procedures in place to get these criminals off the streets.
Yes, everything we've done, I think, since March certainly has been about trying to close that gap between current operational capability and what we may have to fall back on. There's been an enormous amount of work done with colleagues such as the NCA and ACRO and the Home Office to try and do this, the sort of semi-automation pilot I've talked about around missing people, the stuff that Steve's just talked about that sort of semi-robotic process they're doing. So we've constantly tried to hone down time lag, demand on forces. So from my point of view, of course, mine's everything from missing people all the way through. This is about all of policing. So for us, it's about being very conscious that whatever we do, whatever we design, whatever we try and change policy, it's about trying to cut down demand. And one of the things we just talked about extradition is we're currently in discussions with the Home Office about introducing a power of arrest for red notices. So of course we know that's one of our kind of biggest challenges. So the argument we've put forward is that actually if we are working with member states in the EU at the moment, so we trust their processes under the ECHR, that's why we use European arrest warrants with them, why wouldn't we have a power of arrest for a red notice in relation to those 27 member states? So what we're trying to do is close that gap that says I don't want an officer being put in a really tricky position where they've got somebody wanted for a serious offence in front of them and they can't do anything with it.
Would that require primary legislation?
It would, yes.
And have you seen any drafting of primary legislation?
It's being drafted with the Home Office. My understanding is it won't be in before October the 31st, but they're hoping to get it into the next session.
Just if I may follow up on your question, have we done everything we can? I think we have, but just to reiterate, point maybe already made, the caveat on all this is a lot of our functionality does depend on EU member states' use of the I-24/7 system. For some, that is already business as usual. For others, it will require them to some additionality. And that we have been working incredibly hard with a process of engagement right across Europe, explaining the challenges that we face, and seeking assurances that the Interpol system will be heavily used. We've been encouraged by the response. It's absolutely clear that EU member states want to continue to work closely, operationally with us. We will have to see just how effective that process is.
Yeah.
I think we were first told about looking to get primary legislation in for red notices back in the spring, maybe sort of February, March time.
Right.
Has it been being discussed for a long time?
It's certainly been driven forward. I think the initial conversations we had were, why haven't we got one? How can we make this better? Obviously, I think at that time we were driving towards the 29th of March, as was. And since then, obviously, we've upped the gear and the tempo with the Home Office to try and push this through. So I think there's been more appetite, certainly, since the 29th of March.
It just has a slight thing of, why is this not ready in time?
It's a power that we would welcome.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Rehman, Chishti.
Yeah, can I just ask a couple of questions on the International Crime Coordination Centre, which is supposed to be the central hub for no-till contingency planning.
Yes.
And looking at the media reports, we're told that it's up and running in February.
Yep.
Can I just ask you three things that it's achieved? And also, do you think it's achieved everything it needed to achieve by this stage if we were to leave on the 31st of October?
Sure, I think it's achieved some stunning successes. I think it's something we hadn't had before. I think out of necessity we've introduced something that police forces have not had and probably didn't know they needed. So International Crime Coordination Centre is a group of experts we've drawn from all over British policing. So people that are experts in extradition, people that have worked in Europol, people that have been used to executing European arrest warrants and joint investigation teams. Since its inception, and we kind of went totally live probably just before March the 29th, as you'd imagine, dealt with over 1,000 cases on behalf of policing. That's ranged everything from murder to family liaison to missing people to setting up operational meetings between overseas partners and UK policing to be able to move forward operational policing across all of that. We've obviously been influencing the national stage, which talked about red notices and legislation. We now have what I think is a truly multifunctional centre. So we now have the Crown Prosecution Service embedded, we have the National Crime Agency, we have ACRO, we have PSNI and Police Scotland. So we've brought together a bunch of experts. So in relation to things like international letters of request and mutual legal assistance, we know that's going to be a big thing in the future. We've got the CPS's ex-policy lead now working in the unit. So we've now just created templates that provide consistency to forces that speed up the process. So all of those things, as I said before, we've trained 300 tactical advisors across the country. We've given over 7,000 officers individual training. There's a massive comms plan. We've redeveloped all of the authorised professional practice, policy, guidance. We are now working on apps, as in iPhone and iTube apps, just to make sure that forces and officers on the ground have up-to-date information that tells them exactly what they need to do around current plans, contingency plans in the future. So it's achieved an enormous amount of work.
And just a clarification on that. So how many officers and staff are employed by this centre?
So we have about 65 in total. We have the central unit, the central hub, which is based in London and gives that 24/7 support, is around 40 officers.
Yeah.
There are 2 officers in every one of the MPCC regions in England and Wales, which is obviously 10 regions. And again, in addition to that, we have 300 tactical advisors that are spread across forces, just to make sure that we have a 3-tiered approach to being able to deliver this on the ground. So some of the back record conversion we've been talking about, so for back record conversion, I'm talking about SIS alerts that we're already putting onto the I-24/7 process. Some of my officers in the counties have been driving that activity and working with chiefs to make sure we do that.
And were these additional roles, or were these redeployed from elsewhere, or are these agency staff?
So these are additional posts, but they are officers brought in from policing from a wide range and some contractors as well.
So what is the cost of that?
The funding is just over £6 million a year.
Yeah. And tell me, and the role between the National Crime Coordination Centre and the International Crime Coordination Centre, how do those two roles overlap?
You mean the ICB and NCA?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Steve will probably talk on behalf of his. So if I do mine first, so the International Crime Coordination Centre is there to support all of policing. So that means everybody from a police community support officer, uniformed officers, detective. It does everything from missing people to just whether that's a person being involved in a road traffic collision, all the way through murder, serious and organised crime. The idea is you've got a bunch of problem-solving people that if an officer rings up and says, I've just been dealt with a car crash, I've got a French national that's injured and I've got a witness that's run off, we can help them understand the best way to achieve what they need to achieve. A bit like going to the GP and saying, I've got these symptoms, how can you help?
Can I just ask on that? So are you saying now you're in a far better position and prepared than you were in March to deal with the scenario if we were to leave on the 31st with no deal?
We were prepared in March.
Fully prepared.
Fully prepared in March. The centre was up and running and the officers are there.
Yeah.
I would say we're better prepared now, yes, but not because the ICCC wasn't set up. That's more about us streamlining the processes we've been able to do, and some of the testimony we've given this morning, whether it's cutting down the impact on forces, whether it's piloting semi-automatic process. So are we more prepared now? Yes, but that's because we've gone back over all of those policies, all of the training we've been given to re-hone it and redefine it.
Can I just ask this quick clarification on that? We were told by the Home Secretary when he came here in November about the issue about the coordination centre with France to deal with the issue of people crossing illegally to this country, and that would have a real impact on the number of people coming over, but it hasn't. So with regards to that centre, we were told, was working very well, and yet the numbers increased, and therefore questions were raised how effectively that coordination centre was working. How can we be confident with the statements to say that this centre will be working as well as it should be?
I'm not sure what centre you're talking about.
Yeah, that's
one of yours, okay.
Yeah.
I think you need to understand what the ICCC is there for. So it's there to provide guidance and advice and tactical advice and work with partners for all of UK policing. So that means working with foreign law enforcement colleagues and working with police officers on the ground. So can I say it's successful? Well, yes, it is successful. As I said before, we've dealt with over 1,000 cases. The amount of ability to deliver tactical advice at the time, I can give you numerous operational examples, from being able to put together cases that have been running for 8 years that we've managed to put together literally in hours by engaging with our foreign law enforcement communities and bringing people together. So I can confidently say it's a very successful
Can I ask a question before I move over to Storehouse?
Yeah.
You've talked about the success and what it's achieved,
yeah.
And why you're positive that it will be a success in the future if we were to leave on 31st. What are the challenges? Because there must be challenges, and how can they be overcome?
Well, I think the challenges are that sort of capability gap that we've been talking about at the moment. So, the current tools that we have, the gap between those and what we may have in the future. So the challenges are us continuing to look for creative ways of closing those elements. I guess the other challenge is if we crash out on the 31st of October, for instance, it's about what level of demand may we get in the centre. So at the moment, obviously, I've given you examples about how much we're using it. Will there be a suddenly increase because forces are suddenly deluging us with inquiries? That's a challenge. We don't really know what that'll look like, but we will manage it and flex to meet that demand. And I think, most of the areas of demand we know are that capability gap, which is why we are constantly trying to find ways to close them.
Yeah, Mr. Woodhouse, you know what I'm talking about border crossing, because I've asked that question to you before when you came to this committee on border crossing. Yeah. We're given assurances that coordination centre with France to address the issue of illegal migration to the country would help reduce that, but it hasn't. So when we talk about this International Crime Coordination Centre, National Police Coordination Centre, when we've had a system which hasn't worked as it should have done before, how can we take these assurances seriously that it would work?
I think they're very different types of bodies and organisations. I mean, my background is in policing. I see and saw at first hand the capability gap and the knowledge gap in forces who are faced with problems that are increasingly international in nature, faced with using tools that are complicated and unfamiliar and needing advice and expertise. And that's what Richard has delivered. And I think that's absolutely essential, and my team are embedded into the ICCC, and I think that is a really sensible thing to do, to bring together expertise for a complex area. I think it's an entirely different type of concept to a coordination centre with France dealing with a particular issue. I'm happy to talk about that at any time, but I think these are fundamentally different.
No, I get the point I raised with Mr. Rodhouse is this. It's, of course I accept they're fundamentally different. But what I'm saying is we were told about another international coordination centre with another partner which hadn't worked. So I'm just trying to ask the question is, with these centres that are being set up, how confident can we be that they will achieve what they are supposed to achieve, and therefore with these resources that we have over here, that there would not have any redeployment, if there is redeployment, there will not be any knock-on effect on other operations that police should be doing?
Yeah, I understand that. I come back to the point that using international powers and tools as an operational officer is a challenge, and it needs expert advice to allow you to do it, and that's not been available to people. So what Richard delivers is something that is highly important, and it has brought together expertise in one place, and it's quite clear from the numbers that a lot of people are making use of that. And of course it's right, I know Richard would support me in this, of course it's right that should be reviewed going forward in terms of its effectiveness. Yeah, but from where I stand at the moment, from someone who understands the challenges of operational officers in policing, and actually also has a responsibility for the UK International Criminality Bureau, which delivers our contact with European partners in a tactical sense, it's a really valid tool, really important.
I think the other thing, can I just...
Sure, of course.
Sorry, I suppose the other thing as well is it's, the context of policing in the country, of course, is because we've had these tools that have been pretty well automated, and obviously some of the evidence we're giving you today, is that actually your expertise in policing around international instruments tends to be in very niche, very specialist units. So, units that are doing with serious and organised crime. Actually, what this unit is doing, what we're trying to push down is, international criminality is business as usual for everyone. So the idea that we can promulgate the knowledge and the advice and the guidance down to the officer on the beat or the officer on the response team is really, really critical, especially as we have to fall back on these contingencies.
Can I just say, point to you, and this is my last question, I'm not doubting the commitment of officers at the front line at any level, but what I'm asking is the task that's been given to you to deliver in the period of time, is that achievable? Because at the end of the day, it's delivered.
It's delivered.
And there will be no issues with taking that forward post 31st.
The unit, no, not at all. The unit is up, it's been delivering, it's been working.
And the
since
effectiveness
February.
of this, what it was designed to achieve, there will be no issues with that at all come 31st.
It's delivering exactly what it was designed to do. In fact, it's delivering more than it was designed to do.
Okay, Janet Daby.
Hi, good morning. Is there anything more you can say on the impact of operations? And I'm thinking around the area of county lines and serious youth violence as well. Anything more you can say which will be things that we need to be concerned about how operations are affected?
Perhaps I should pick that up.
Yeah, sure.
So I think it's well known to everyone that crime is increasingly international. The county lines phenomenon it spreads across exploitation of young people, but it is driven by the drugs trade, and we know the drugs trade is international. Indeed, you'll see from the media this morning a seizure of heroin, 1.3 tonnes, that originated from Pakistan, that was going to make its way undoubtedly into the UK drug market, undoubtedly to have been transported through county lines. So this is a very real and present issue. And of course, that case in particular, which was taken forward by the National Crime Agency alongside the Belgian and Dutch authorities, absolutely shows the importance of dynamic, flexible operational arrangements and information sharing between countries. That is what we are seeking to protect, because that's grown up over a long time. I think that need is recognised not just in the UK but by European partners as well. And what we see from our engagement is a real appetite to continue to share that sort of information and to respond at pace where the need is. And that case actually demonstrated it really well, the need to be able to deploy operational officers in a concerted fashion between 3 countries. I have no doubt that we will continue to operate in that fashion, because law enforcement does. Law enforcement is a can-do arena, and I'm really confident in that. We would be supported if we had routes to continue to share information at scale across Europe through Europol. But in the event that we don't, we will continue to share information bilaterally with individual countries, much as we've done on this job that I refer to. And I have no doubt that will continue to help us tackle the international crime threat.
So just so I can understand, obviously there's the appetite for it, and you're confident that those communications will continue. But because of the different way it can't be done through Europol, and it's got to be done bilaterally, is there a delay? Does this produce a level of risk in some way?
So not necessarily. So Europol is really important to allow us to understand the threat. Our membership of Europol, our access to the joint analysis pool that Europol hold, is really important to allow us to understand the threat and deconflict our operations too. But actually, our operational activity is often bilateral as well. So if it comes to allowing individual countries to deploy surveillance resources or to ask each other to deploy officers in a particular situation, often in fast time that is already done on a bilateral basis, because that is the quickest way of doing things. And I'm confident that the mechanisms for that will continue.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Tim Wilson?
I was just, sorry.
It's Jim McDonald.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of follow-up questions on Europol, first of all. If we crash out with no deal, can you let us know what happens to joint operations that the UK is involved in at that time? Can we carry on? I think Lynn Owen said that she was hopeful that would be the case, but it depended on some sort of legal agreement.
So joint investigation teams, I think the number is 54, I will check that for you, have already been transitioned to the arrangements that will follow after EU exit. So there will be continuity in those investigations.
Even if there's no deal?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That's good. But afterwards, it is correct to say that the UK wouldn't be able to instigate or lead joint operations?
Yeah. There's probably a twin track. So under the 1959 convention, we could still lead a joint investigation team. It would be under that convention, not under the Eurojust as is. The only difference is Eurojust, when you do a joint investigation team, comes with funding to allow you to go over and plan operational meetings. The 59 convention doesn't. So there's a monetary difference. But other than that, it's exactly the same. But of course, for other European countries who are still able to use JITs post whenever we leave, they can still invite us to be part of that. So if they had intelligence and information that said, I guess leading back to your county lines piece, which is drugs are coming in from Amsterdam or Antwerp, and the Dutch are involved, the Spanish and the French, and we know it's coming to a port in England, they could still invite us to be part of a JIT. So we wouldn't lead it, but we'd be part of it, so it would allow that operational crossover to continue.
Okay. And in terms of access to data tools like Sienna and so on after no deal, you spoke about the fact that on day one that you'd suddenly have to have all these intensive negotiations for bilateral arrangements. I think you used the word days, hopefully. But in that period of days, what is the impact? What are the dangers, and what is it we're losing access to exactly? What sort of information?
If we crashed out without a deal, then we come out of Europol until we can negotiate our way back into a third-party agreement, I suppose, in the way that Canada does, the American and Australians do. But that would mean for that period of time whilst that negotiation is going on, you would lose access to Sienna and to the tools that we currently use because we wouldn't actually be in Europol.
And what can you say more about what that actually means, or what sort of information is it that we are losing access to on Sienna, and how will that impact on day-to-day policing?
Yeah, so Sienna is a secure communications channel between member states, so you can share intelligence and information, so you can do it instantly. It's like an email, really, between member states. So you would lose the ability to do that. You would have to either go through an Interpol route or go through a partnership route. You'd lose access to European Intelligence System, EIS. So all those tools that we currently use, we just wouldn't have access to. We'd have to either go through Interpol or go through a third party, so it would delay things that we were doing.
And in terms of trying to do it on a bilateral or partnership basis in the meantime, I think we were told previously that some countries might be more willing to do that than others. There could be problems, for example, with Germany, just because of some constitutional safeguards it has around data protection and so on. Is there an analysis about where there might be difficulties getting information sharing done?
Yeah, the Home Office have done some work around that, so they've been plotting which countries will automatically be okay with extradition. Germany's one where they don't extradite their own nationals because of their constitution, but you can prosecute in those countries if you have somebody. So there would have to be some arrangements. But the Home Office has done quite a lot of work, and I don't have it to hand, but they've been mapping that out about where they need to kind of interdict.
Absolutely. And to give us the capacity to do that, the National Crime Agency are surging additional international liaison officers into European embassies to allow that bilateral relationship to flourish.
And how long do you anticipate that this sort of broader operational agreement would take to negotiate?
Well, as I said earlier, it's not something that we are able to influence. We hope for it as quickly as possible, but actually the mechanics of negotiating that are something that we are personally not sighted on.
How long did it take the Americans, for example, to do you know?
I have to say, I don't know how long it took the Americans. There's a number of stages to go through, and it is exceptionally complicated. So the first stage you could go through, and it's not necessarily the case that these are sequentially, is a working arrangement which would give some access to the Sienna messaging system, which would be useful because that would allow us to use it to message EU member states, but crucially not Europol as a concept. The next stage would be an operational agreement, but that would require a data adequacy agreement with the EU. And of course that is fairly crucial, that would allow the exchange of personal data, and that's with Europol. Yeah. That's not to say you couldn't exchange personal data with individual states or individual states en masse, but not through Europol. So it is really complicated.
But that would depend on those individual countries' own provisions. Again, as I understood it, some of them might have slightly higher standards.
That's true. And as Richard said, a lot of in-depth analysis and negotiation being undertaken by the Home Office. My sense is actually that predominantly EU member states have indicated their willingness to continue to share that personal data, but I haven't got the detail on that.
And a final quick question, if I may, going back to this issue about what's on the SIS2 database as opposed to the I-24/7 database. You've given these incredible figures about how there's 82 million alerts in one and hundreds of thousands in the other. But in terms of the nature of those alerts, I mean, is there any rhyme or reason as to why countries put some only on SIS2 and not on I-24/7? Or is it, for example, can you assure me that there are not alerts about very serious criminals that are only on SIS2 as opposed to I-24/7?
So I can't give you that assurance. The reasons why countries would use SIS2 rather than I-24/7 or both, sometimes it comes down to geography. Yeah. It'll come down to where they typically would expect people to be found. And of course, if you're in Europe and you don't have any external borders, then you might think that SIS2 is the appropriate route to take. What I can't assure you are that countries will have put a SIS2 alert on for a serious criminal and it's not replicated on Interpol I-24/7. That may well be the case, and that's one of the challenges.
Okay, so you're talking serious violence, murders, drugs, conceivably...
A range of offences. Yeah. You would expect, of course, that the more serious offences, EU member states would have taken the step of putting it on both systems, but I can't sit here and give you a guarantee that we know that to be the case. I mean, to be clear, we do know that EU member states make extensive use of I-24/7 because, of course, they are guarding against their people, and we're but they're guarding against them leaving Europe, of course, so that's why I-24/7 is important. The other point to make, of course, is we're talking a lot about people here. Those I-24/7 alerts and SIS2 alerts include property and vehicles, and millions of those alerts will be around property indexes as well.
Yeah, and sorry, I'll just add to that. I mean, it really is down to the individual member state about how much they use 24/7. And to be fair, we've not been the greatest at using it either. Look at missing people. Just really on. We have 200,000 odd people go missing a year, and I think we probably put 10 people on the Interpol system last year because we relied on SIS2, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of our member states do the same.
Thank you.
So how many of the 27 EU countries put all of their SIS2 information onto the I-24 system?
Couldn't get. I don't know. I can find out for you and write back to you, but I don't know.
I'm slightly surprised you don't know that. I'm slightly surprised you don't have a sort of clear assessment of the scale of the gap.
Well, we've been working with the Home Office. So the Home Office have got a mapping system where they've done that. So I don't have it to hand. That's the only
So
reason
they
why I
have
can't
it.
answer. Yeah.
And how many EU countries put all of their red notices, or all of their European arrest warrants, also on the red notice system?
That I don't know.
It's the same issue. We know that a lot of mapping has been done on that, and it's formed the engagement plan that the Home Office have delivered.
And would it surprise you if none of them put all of their either alerts or arrest warrants onto the Interpol systems?
It wouldn't surprise me if they don't put all of them on, because of course if you're in a country and you expect that person not to go outside those 27 member states, there actually would be no reason at the moment to put them on the I-24/7 system, because of course we are still in at the moment. Now that may be changing, and we've certainly been talking to partners about the need to do that, otherwise we don't have visibility. But at this current time it wouldn't surprise me, because if you are confident they're not going anywhere else and they might go in 3 or 4 different countries, then you wouldn't need to.
Tim Lawton.
DAC Martin, you've repeatedly used the term crashing out without a deal. Is that a neutral term?
It's just a descriptor. Yeah, I'd say that was neutral from my behind.
You do think that's a neutral term to use?
Yeah.
When we had Rob Wainwright here as just after he stood down as head of Europol, he said that every form of cooperation that happens now and every form of information sharing that happens now, notwithstanding the fact that we wouldn't be on the board, could still happen after BrExit. It was entirely a political question. Do you agree with his analysis?
If he means, is it available because it's been negotiated or there's a transition period, then yes. If we leave the EU without a deal, then some of those systems you will not have access until they've been negotiated back.
No, but his point was, regardless of deal or no deal, that everything that happens now could continue to happen, subject only to political decisions, rather than any lack of preparedness by our other partners within Europol to continue operating at the same level as we do now.
I think if you're talking about intent, then yes. But of course, you're governed by whatever framework is in place that allows you to do that in whatever format that is. So can you continue to do things? Yes, because that's why we have these contingency plans. Can you do it in quite the same way? No, because that depends on what new contingencies allow you to do. Have you negotiated to have the same? So if you went down the sort of strategy that was published about 18 months ago by government, which we support, which is we'd like to keep everything we currently have and have the flexibility to meet future threats, then yes. But it depends either what is negotiated or what we've had to fall back on as a contingency.
Okay, but those are political negotiations rather
they are, yes.
Rather than operational
problems. I say operational. They're operational in the way that it's whatever the framework is there as to what Steve and I and other law enforcement partners can work to. So it's whatever that framework allows us to do.
But to come back to Mr. McDonald's questions, and I think, Rodhouse, you described it as law enforcement as a can-do arena. Has there been any serious pushback from future corporations, from any countries, notwithstanding technical constitution issues that Germany has, for example, as you've already mentioned? Have there been serious indications that any of our current partners within Europol are going to say effectively, well, you're no longer part of Europol, therefore you're a second-class citizen?
No, not at all. If you talk to operational partners, what they'll say is pretty much what I'm saying. They want to work with us, they see the value of working with UK policing, and the comments we often get back is, but of course we'll make it work, but it will depend on what the legal framework is that allows us to do that.
So to take a practical example, and the big heroin haul, which is very good news, and I think you mentioned Belgium involved in that. If that were to happen next year with or without a deal, what will the practical differences be as to how the police will go around trying to bring that about?
So without going into lots of operational details, I am confident that that sort of operation could and would still happen after EU exit. To be clear, I don't think that operation was reliant on anything that we're talking about here other than really strong operational relationships between close European partners. I think that's absolutely the case.
Would you agree with that?
No, absolutely. I think we've talked earlier on about the ability to still have joint investigation teams, albeit in a different format. That allows you to intelligence share, to work with partners and do all the things. I mean, I wouldn't go into Steve's operation, I don't know all about it, but I'm absolutely in agreement with Steve. Yes, that could still happen.
The issue around Europol, and I didn't see Rob Wainwright's evidence at all, and I think it's right to say that the information sharing could take place with appropriate negotiations and will and decision making. There's no bar to that if the negotiations took us in that direction. As it stands at the moment, however, even if we got the most ambitious operational agreement, and that's clearly from my perspective what we would like, it does remain the case that we would not have the influence in Europol that we currently do to drive operational activity, to influence priorities, to sit on the management board. Now, of course, you might say that that could be negotiated as well, and who am I to say it couldn't? But as it stands at the moment, that's a reduction of our influence. We would absolutely want to see an ambitious operational agreement to allow us to access the significant joint analysis and intelligence that sits across Europe, because it helps us in our operations. And frankly, we help to inform Europe's understanding of the crime threat as well.
And how much of a practical issue do you think that will be, not having that seat at the table? Because I know when the committee last went to Europol, the most people most in evidence seem to be officers from Homeland Security, who are very much within Europol, very much operationally part of Europol, and I think don't even pay rent for the fact they've got officers within Europol and seem to have more officers there than the French that we met for example. So the fact that we aren't an equal board member of Europol in the future, in practical terms, is that a big issue?
I think it remains to be seen. I genuinely wouldn't want to speculate on that. You're absolutely right. The Americans have a significant presence at Europol, and they clearly find it valuable. And I think we would, in whatever form we were there. But our inability to sit on management, on the Europol management board, is one thing. Our inability to drive the joint projects and lead and direct them may well be significant. We know, for example, that firearms are a significant threat in this country, and we regard firearms trafficking and use to some extent in a different fashion to some of our European partners. By us driving and having influence in Europol, we can gain some influence to protect the UK from that threat, as an example. But I think that we will see.
Thank you.
Fran, just very quick questions. Can you confirm that if we end up with no deal and have Operation Stack in place, you are expecting a heavy police commitment to support Operation Stack?
I would have to defer to my colleagues that are doing contingency planning. I'm sorry, not my area of expertise.
Okay. And then Neil Basu said last month that no deal, quote, would create an immediate risk that people could come to this country who were serious offenders, either wanted or still serial and serious offenders committing crimes in this country, and we would not know about it. It creates that risk. With my police leadership hat on, there would still be deep concern. There would be some damage to our safety. Do you agree with that assessment?
So I suspect what Neil was talking about there was the ability of operational officers to have information at their fingertips about people's background, and at the moment that is delivered through SIS2. We've talked about the contingencies, the mitigations we're putting in place through I-24/7, and we've talked about the gaps as well. So if that's the context that Neil was talking about, then yes, I would agree that there are gaps that are concerning.
Yes.
And in your assessment, given how important is it from a purely policing operational point of view to have a deal in place?
From an operational point of view, I think because we've always said we want to keep the tools we currently have, we'd like the ability to have some time to further refine our plans, and I think I think the risk of leaving without a deal is a challenge for policing.
If a deal could close some of the gaps and challenges that we've talked about today, then clearly that is something that I would favour.
Thank you very much for your time, and thank you also for the considerable preparations. Oh, I apologise, I have one further question. How much is it costing, all of these preparations for no deal?
For my unit, 6.2 million a year.
For the National Crime Agency for 1920, £10.6 million. I'm not so sure on the 6, but in the region of £10 million a year. We don't have an agreed settlement for next year.
And are there additional resources going into individual forces on this as well, or is that the sum total?
That currently for policing for us, certainly for my area, I'm not sure about contingency planning. They may well be getting additional funding. I'd have to check for you.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank
We'll
you.
move on to our second panel. Welcome our second panel, and can I apologise that we will probably need to finish this session at 11:45 for members to be able to get into the main chamber. So I would ask you to give as concise answers as is possible. Could you all briefly introduce yourselves and set out your responsibilities on no deal preparation? DCC Martin.
Yes, I am the Deputy Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, and amongst a range of my responsibilities is to be the Senior Responsible Officer for the PSNI's preparations for the exiting of the European Union.
Mr May.
Peter May, Permanent Secretary in the Department of Justice. We're responsible looking at those justice and security issues as they affect Northern Ireland in a devolved space.
Dr McCormick.
Andrew McCormick, Director General for International Relations in the Executive Office, which means I lead the whole Brexit preparation for the NICS team.
And Ms Pearson.
Hello, I'm the Director of EU Relations in the Executive Office and I work for Andrew.
Thank you very much. Could I ask you just initially, just following on from the session that we've just had, your assessment of how these issues around European arrest warrant, around SIS2, around security and policing cooperation will play out in terms of Northern Ireland, what the scale of the challenge is in terms of the numbers of European arrest warrants or red notices, and what preparations that you have made for this. DCC Martin.
Well, if I can start,
yep.
And then Stephen maybe say some more about some of the detailed operational issues. I think that we've been working very closely with both the Home Office and with the Department of Justice and Equality in Dublin to try to secure mitigations in the event that the UK leaves the EU without a deal. And the two critical areas are in relation to European arrest warrants and the exchange of data. What I would say is that all of the issues as they affect Northern Ireland are shared on a UK-wide basis. It's just that they matter more to Northern Ireland because the level of engagement on a cross-border basis, particularly with Garda Síochána and other justice authorities, is just so much greater than would be the case for any individual force in the rest of the United Kingdom. On European arrest warrants, the Irish government and the UK government have agreed measures to ensure that there is an ongoing arrangement that will replace the European arrest warrants. It will rely on the 1957 Council of Europe Convention. We understand and expect that that will be a slower and more resource-intensive process, but it is one that we believe should still enable extradition between the two nations. Similarly, in relation to data exchange, there is an agreement in place, and the Irish government published in July and recognised this explicitly, that there is a data sharing agreement in place which will allow for the continued sharing of data, both, for example, in relation to policing, but also in relation to probation services and sex offenders and all of the rest of it on an all-island basis. So We believe that there are mitigations that will prevent the worst dimensions in relation to a no deal. I don't have the numbers for the number of European arrest warrants currently outstanding, but it's a moving picture. Obviously, every day it changes. I don't know, Stephen, whether you have any more information in relation to that?
In terms of the numbers, we would generate in the period September 18 to August 19, the Police Service of Northern Ireland generated 38 European arrest warrants. 12 of those went to EU, other than Ireland, and 26 of those went to Ireland. Received by ourselves, we received 44 from the EU, other than Ireland, and we received 5 from Ireland. At the risk of just repeating what Peter said, I think he's addressed, our preparations for European arrest warrants and the management and the exchange of information is as described. We play our part with the ICCC that Richard Martin, your previous witness, leads on. PSNI are part of that. We've been part of that from its infancy. And we seek to exploit the fallback measures that he will have described to you in evidence. And then there is additional work that has been going on between Peter and colleagues and the Department of Justice in Ireland, trying to get particular arrangements and ensure for the exchange of information and in the absence of EAWs post the withdrawal between the Police Service of Northern Ireland and Garda Síochána, because obviously whilst we engage with the rest of Europe, it's much more acutely felt, potentially, the issues between ourselves and the Republic of Ireland.
And so on the red notices, so you'll use the same red notices
we will,
system
in the
place
absence
of the
of SIS2.
And which court will you have to go to in order to get those to get permission to arrest based on a red notice?
We would have to go to one of the local courts in Northern Ireland.
So you don't have to go to Westminster Magistrates Court to get permission to arrest based on the red notice?
No, we would go to, it's my understanding, we would go to courts in Northern Ireland. We have our own court system there with our own Lord Chief Justice. Obviously we're part of the whole United Kingdom, and our ultimate court of appeal is the Supreme Court, but we have our own court of appeal, for example. And obviously that is the issue at the moment. Officers on the knowledge that a European arrest warrant exists can arrest at the time of detection of the individual, but potentially relying on an Interpol red notice, there's no power of arrest, and we would have to go to court to seek that warrant for arrest.
And similarly in the Republic of Ireland, if they have a red notice, do they have to go to court first, or can they just arrest straight away?
I'm not aware of how it would work in the Republic of Ireland's jurisdiction. Okay,
that feels like quite an important thing in terms of understanding the sort of the time lags and the capability gap.
For them.
Well, actually for us, if we want somebody that we've put out, we would previously have put out a European arrest warrant, now we've put out a red notice. Yep. We hope, because we're working closely with them, that they're looking at the red notices where other countries might not be, but it'd still be quite helpful to understand if they can pick people up straight away or if there's going to be a time lag.
Yeah, I would need to find that out from consultation with the other jurisdiction and come back to you on that.
Okay. Janet Daby.
Well, it's sort of on the same lines, really. It's about what would the impact be with the loss of EU tools in your ability to work closely with the Republic of Ireland, and that is clearly one has been identified straight away in terms of not being aware of how the Republic of Ireland would deal with somebody and how they would get them back to us, which is what we would want. So how else would it impact?
Well, I think I would want to stress at the moment, at the outset, that the PSNI and Garda Síochána cooperate exceptionally well. We are, for example, part of the Joint Agency Task Force that was set up under the Fresh Start arrangements, which was an arrangement under the devolved institutions in Northern Ireland. We cooperate every day. Every day there's an exchange of information about sex offenders, about organised crime. Probably there wouldn't be a day go past that some of our officers and staff are not actually meeting with their counterparts in Garda Síochána, and our commitment to maintaining that professional partnership and relationship is unequivocal. But of course, relationships take you so far. You need the legislative and legal underpinnings to supplement those relationships. Currently, much of those underpinnings are provided by the European Union. If there was a withdrawal that saw those European justice measures fall away, we will be reliant on the arrangements that Richard Martin will have briefed you on. For example, the 57 Convention instead of European arrest warrants, the 59 legislation in relation to the sharing of information, for example, Interpol as opposed to SIS2. And all those arrangements will work, hopefully, and work to a good extent, but they will be slower generally, they will be more bureaucratic generally, and they will certainly be suboptimal compared to the package of measures that we have now. But there has been a recognition of this from some time ago, and we've been working with our partners in Garda Síochána, with our partners in the Department of Justice and in the Irish Government to try and ensure that whatever happens, that we have the best fallback measures available pending political developments and the creation of new, if it is indeed, new legislation, new treaties between the United Kingdom government and other member states of the EU.
Do you anticipate a time delay in terms of outcomes in the work, because obviously certain legislation isn't in place if we were to crash out on a
I think a lot of the mechanisms that have been described to you will be slower. So access to criminal records will be slower. You've been through this in the previous session. The use of the Interpol I-24/7 will require double keying by the member states. The prevailing member states will obviously still be sharing information on the SIS2 system, but we will then ask them to share information with us on the I-24/7 system, which will require double keying. It will also be subject, because there will be two systems, it will be subject to data adequacy issues. So there's no doubt that many of the measures will be clunkier and will be slower. Ultimately, it's our ambition and our desire that they will work, pending the United Kingdom's government's political developments with the EU. Clearly, we are apolitical on the issue of the European exit. Our interest is as law enforcement professionals, protecting people, detecting offenders, and we enjoy measures now that are well tested and work. And we would just like to see that whatever happens, that sort of package of measures is ultimately replicated.
Have you considered how this will affect the morale of staff and how you would manage this?
Sorry, could you...
Have you considered how this would affect the morale of your officers, really, and your other staff, and how this would affect people's day-to-day work in terms of how they feel about their work, the delay? It'd be a difficult... It sounds like it would be a very difficult adjustment.
Well, I'm proud and pleased to say that the officers and staff who work for the Police Service of Northern Ireland have a very strong public service ethos. And whilst, of course, there may be some frustration if something takes 60 days as opposed to the current 6 days, there may be some frustration with that, but our public service ethos will carry us through, and probably pressures will be felt in other ways as a consequence of the European exit for the Police Service of Northern Ireland, depending on what the border looks like, for example.
Thank you.
Stuart Dalton.
Thank you very much. Could I ask specifically about arrangements for extradition between the North and South after a no-deal Brexit? How would that impact upon extradition procedures?
Well, extradition at the moment we rely on the European arrest warrant, just as all other parts of the UK do. We've, through detailed discussions and arrangements between the Home Office, ourselves, and the Department of Justice and Equality in Ireland, we've agreed how that will operate using the 1957 Convention. As Stephen has said, we anticipate that will be a slower process. Of course, there's a risk because we have not been using that process for a very significant amount of time. And if you go back 30 years, then extradition was a challenging and difficult issue, particularly between North and South. But our discussions with Southern authorities, with Irish authorities, suggest that they're fully signed up to the need to ensure that there is a viable means of extradition. And they referenced that in the contingency plan they published in July 2019, where they state measures will be in place to ensure a viable extradition system with the UK in a no-deal scenario. So we are also engaged in detailed discussions with them about how in-flight cases will work. In other words, cases that are currently subject to European arrest warrant, and that European arrest warrant provision will then end at whatever point that we leave the European Union if there isn't a deal. And there are mechanisms in place to ensure that those cases don't simply just fall through a hole in the system, and that they're captured. That will require judicial processes within Ireland in order to enable that to happen.
But is it enough simply to rely on the old convention that used to be relied on, given there's a land border there? Is there not a need to try and come to a bilateral agreement on a particular issue?
At the moment, this is being led at a nation-state level. It is certainly our aspiration after the UK has left the European Union that a future relationship is developed with the European Union that puts in place as many, or the equivalent of as many of these measures as is possible. Certainly in relation to extradition, we're not saying that the 1957 Convention will be as good as European arrest warrants, but we believe it is a viable means of ensuring extradition can continue to happen.
How long, I mean, is it not the case that could take a considerable period of time to come to an agreement with the EU27 as a whole? I mean, there have been examples of other countries taking several years to get to that point.
And indeed, clearly, that's not something that's within our gift, and I'm no better placed to judge how long it would take than anybody else. There is, under the Good Friday Agreement, an intergovernmental agreement on policing and one on criminal justice, and that operates on a north-south basis. There could be some opportunities through those agreements, but again, you'll understand at the moment we're operating without political direction in the devolved space, and you would clearly need political direction in order to take forward any measures under those agreements, which are in addition to what is already in place.
And just to double check, I should really know the answer to this, but I mean, is it even possible for the UK to come to a specific bilateral agreement with the Republic of Ireland on extradition, or does it have to be done through the whole EU27?
I suspect that any agreement, if it were to be done bilaterally, would need to be compatible with the wider EU arrangements.
Okay. In relation to what we heard earlier about access for law enforcement agencies to all the various databases like SIS2 and so on, has all of that just been coordinated at a UK level, or are there special bits of work being carried out in Northern Ireland?
It's all being done at the UK level. Most of the issues are no different for us than elsewhere. Indeed, in relation to SIS2, it's worth noting that Ireland isn't currently a member of SIS2, although they have plans to join it. Similarly, in relation to Prüm, they're not currently a member but have plans to join it. So there would be no loss on a north-south basis in relation to those two elements, at least in the short term. That's just a piece of information you may or may not be aware of.
That's helpful, thanks. Finally, we had some reports just in the last couple of weeks about UK government perhaps requiring EU citizens to undertake criminal record checks before they can live or work in the UK, including after a no-deal Brexit. Have you had discussions with the UK government about those proposals and how that might have an impact in terms of the common travel area?
So the ECRIS system, which I think may be what you're referring to, is around the relation of criminal records, is one of the areas that, along with passenger records, that currently there is no fallback for in relation to a no-deal exit. So we are certainly in discussions with the Home Office, but at the moment there's nothing, I think, that is in place to mitigate that.
But have they said anything about what would happen after a no-deal Brexit? There was talk that, as of day one, first of all, there was talk of ending free movement altogether on day one, and then it seems to have sort of gone back on that a little bit. But there was also talk about, from day one after a no-deal Brexit, increasing the criminality checks that would be done on EU nationals, either at the border or even at the point they seek employment. Or
okay, well, there's no clarity for us about what the position is on relation to freedom of movement currently. But the obvious point to make is that there are no checks on individuals as they move from Ireland into Northern Ireland. The PSNI is not a border force and could not be a border force. And border force itself, while it operates at ports and airports, will undertake some operations in conjunction with the PSNI more widely, does not seek to have a footprint on the border, and that's for, I think, well understood and long-standing reasons. So there would be no means of checking individuals' criminal records as they pass from Ireland to Northern Ireland.
But if they were seeking employment, for example, is the Home Office given any indication to you that employers might now need to do an enhanced criminality check on EU?
So we have a similar system in relation to checking criminal records for people seeking employment, and where appropriate, those tests and checks already involve going to other authorities outside of the UK to establish whether there are relevant criminal records.
And that's in what circumstances when an EU national is seeking employment?
So we have an Access NI system which looks and addresses, as I said, very similar to the arrangements that apply elsewhere in the UK in terms of those enhanced checks for those seeking to work with vulnerable or young people, and then a more basic check for normal employment.
Okay.
Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask, at what stage are discussions about mutual aid from other police forces in the event of a no-deal Brexit?
If I start, or do you want to start, Stephen?
Yeah, well, the mutual aid arrangements are part of the national police contingency plans. We have had access to those for quite some number of years, and in fact drew down on mutual aid for public order assistance in 2013 was the last occasion, but since 2013 we have had those arrangements in place principally for each summer period, for the parading period in Northern Ireland, but thankfully haven't had recourse to them, need to have recourse to them. Because of the uncertainty associated with the exit from the European Union, we have sought to extend those mutual aid arrangements for over the summer, but beyond this year, and to have that contingency available to us in the event that we had, for example, civil unrest or disorder as a consequence of the European Union exit. So those arrangements are well in place. It's done through the national coordinating mechanisms, and we have the capacity to bring in up to 14 public order support units from Great Britain at a time for a week's rotation, and they would be replaced as one batch of 14 would leave, another batch of 14 would come in, and we've certainly that arrangement in place for a period of some months. But it is our earnest hope that we do not need to draw down on that mutual aid, and we would only seek to use it in extreme circumstances where what we were facing was beyond our ability to manage within the PSNI resources.
And as the second biggest force in the country, what proportion of that would you envisage coming from Police Scotland?
That I know there's been public commentary recently from within Police Scotland. It is national arrangements, and I know that some of the assistance that is being put on contingency does come from Police Scotland, and some comes from other services within the England and Wales. As to what we receive is really down to the national coordinating arrangements. It would not be for us to say we want Police Scotland officers over English officers or Welsh officers, we'd be quite happy to have the mutual aid in those circumstances where it was required and we believed it was necessary. But it would be completely down to the national coordinating arrangements as to who we got. But I am aware that there certainly is a likelihood that if we need it and we call upon it, that certainly some of those officers will come from Police Scotland.
And how do you respond to the concerns raised by Callum Steele, the General Secretary of the Scottish Police Federation, about his worries over the safety of Scottish officers if they do go over there?
Well, I would seek to... I understand those concerns, first of all, and I would have empathy with them, but I would also seek to reassure them that the planning is in place, that the logistics are in place, that we would look after the hygiene factors first of all of his officers. They would be well accommodated, they would be well looked after. We would ensure that we would have local liaison officers accompanying them on their deployments, and it would not be our intention to deploy them on the border, but to, I suppose, deploy them in other areas to allow us perhaps to release some of our officers to augment the border area.
Backfilling, if your officers move to the border, to backfill the duties they will be doing.
Or to seats of disorder, which I think...
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't hear that, Mr. Mead.
It could be that they move not to the border but to seats of disorder where the disorder is taking place.
But it would be our intention not to place them in the border areas. Mm-hmm. It would be out with the border. But certainly they are public order resources, so if we are seeking them, it is certainly conceivable that they would be deployed to the potential disorder situations.
How different, if at all, are the training techniques and the operations PSNI use for public order compared to Police Scotland, the Met, or any of the other forces?
There are variations, but I can assure you that the units that are trained to come to Northern Ireland have all been trained to a consistent set of methodology, and those issues have been addressed in the training and preparation.
And at what stage do you make the decision? Obviously, it's difficult to anticipate what happens, but it's also difficult at the click of a finger to get 14 units across, etc., and then start the week's rotation. When would you envisage, if it looks like the country is going to leave without a deal on the 31st of October, that the calls for these deployments from Police Scotland, the Met and others would be made?
Well, we would seek to absorb a certain amount of pressure, first of all. But is it conceivable that there was a very strong and credible intelligence base that looked that very extensive disorder was to occur that was going to be out with our immediate ability to cope without mutual aid, that we would seek the mutual aid in anticipation of that? Yes, that is conceivable. I think it's more likely that we would be experiencing disorder for a period of time and come to a view that actually we need the assistance, because you're quite right that it does take a number of days. It's not like pressing a button and they're there the next day. It takes a number of days for that to be mobilised in the first instance and come over. Once it starts, the rotations will happen in a seamless way, but that first period when we seek it, it does take a number of days. So it is conceivable that we would do it in anticipation, but I would say again, we do see it as a measure to be used in extreme circumstances, and that would be a commitment that we've made to the national coordinating arrangements.
Thank you. And just for complete openness, if I can remind the committee of my declaration of interest, my wife is a Police Scotland officer, but currently on maternity leave, so won't be involved. So just for openness.
Thank you.
And can you just confirm, are the two areas that you would anticipate needing additional police resources, the border and public order?
Well, the mutual aid officers from Great Britain, we do not anticipate putting them in and around the border area.
Sure, I just meant what are the areas where you're expecting increased pressure or increased demand for
on policing? Well, some of that depends on what the withdrawal arrangement looks like.
In the event of no deal? In
the event of no deal, I think the safest way to answer that is it's very uncertain. However, if we saw circumstances, for example, where the land border was re-emphasised in a way that is not currently emphasised, for example, with regulation or checking mechanisms for whatever reason, but the activity of the state in a way that the state does not operate at the moment. I think it's highly foreseeable that that would be resisted, and that resistance inevitably would take the form of threat that the PSNI would have to come in and support, and that would be a pressure we could conceivably see. I think depending on the economic shock associated with the withdrawal, if we did see businesses fold, farms fold, and that economic shock play out in some of the scales that have been scenario planned, for example, then I think the pressure on policing is likely to increase as people become distressed and perhaps engage in criminality. Perhaps we haven't talked about dissident activity as yet. I certainly know that they would seek to exploit any re-emphasisation of the border. So I think there's a whole range of very foreseeable scenarios that could play out, whilst recognising all of it is uncertain, that would lead to pressure on the police service of Northern Ireland in and around the border area. And certainly in terms of street disorder and protest, we could see that at different places in Northern Ireland and not confined to the border area. But it all depends on the nature of the withdrawal and particularly the consequences for people of that withdrawal.
Kate Green.
Just one other question then, it's roughly related. In terms of direct rule, there has been some suggestion that that might be necessary in the event of a no-deal Brexit. How do you think that would be perceived, and what impact might it have on your operations?
Well, direct rule, ultimately the issues that face us in relation to the lack of political authority at the point when we leave the European Union come to what decisions can be taken. Andrew may want to say something more widely about that. In terms of the community reaction to direct rule, I think a lot would depend, as Stephen has already said in response to the chair, on the precise circumstances that we were dealing with, and it's quite hard to make an assessment in abstract around that.
I think there is potential for that to cause considerable tension. Direct rule, by definition, is in tension with the principles of the Good Friday Agreement, which involve a cross-community government. So to reimpose something which is seen as one-sided would definitely create a reaction. It then depends how it plays out in the particular circumstances. So it's something that we're very, very sensitive to. The reason, one reason it isn't in place now is because the parties in going into devolution back in 2007 were very clear that the previous powers to suspend, which happened several times between 1999 and 2002, were not appropriate. They were a crutch that was needed to be removed to ensure that the devolution institutions were as strong as they possibly could be. Now, we've had another set of difficulties, but that principle that there would be continued engagement with devolution is overriding. So that means that direct rule is opposed with all the representatives of the Nationalist Republican side, and would be perceived as a big retrograde step. On the other hand, as Peter has said, there needs to be ministerial decision making in a situation where a very uncertain, fluid, emotional context. That's exactly where ministers need to be in place to take quick, responsive decisions. We can act under the existing legislation in the public interest. That's clear responsibility, but it's a very different thing to be taking responsive decisions to emerging situations. That's where political cover, political choices are absolutely vital.
I'll add something to that.
No, I think that's absolutely right. It's a balance between the impact on communities of direct rule where that's opposed compared to the inability of the civil service to take some key decisions that may well be necessary in a no-deal situation.
And can I ask you just then, in terms of the border preparations and customs preparations in the event of no deal. Obviously, tariffs apply in the event of no deal. What are your current planning? What's your current planning for dealing with that in terms of customs checks and tariffs?
So again, customs are not devolved, but we are saying to UK government that there is a need for deeper and better information for Northern Ireland businesses to prepare. What has been emphasised from the UK side is the decision not to apply tariffs at the land border as a means of demonstrating very firmly that the UK government is not going to do everything that the UK government can do to not reintroduce a hard border. What we have to say is that from an economic, this then links to some of the concerns that Stephen's mentioned already. If there is no deal, then there is a hard economic border immediately, because the EU acquis will apply south of the border, and all trade going there has to either comply or be illegal, and it only can comply if the Irish government establish the means by which the checks and compliance can be assured. Now, whether that's done at the physical border, everyone says no, that's not a practical or real world proposition because of the consequences that would rule out immediately. So, but if there are no checks, then there's no legal basis for trade. So, in a way, no border south of the border is a barrier to trade. Now, if that is mirror imaged by no checks on goods moving from south to north, the risk of that creating a tension is very high. So this applies especially in agri-food, where the EU tariffs are there, they're very high, they're designed to protect the single market, and they would automatically apply. That there's no possibility of the EU legislating to remove them at the land border. So therefore our farmers, our agri-food producers would be unable to export to the south unless they can pay the tariff, and the tariff would make them unviable. And then in the other direction, goods would be moving from south to north. That could be seen as very provocative.
So do you have...
That's a particular potential root cause of some of the security assessments that have been done.
So are you involved in the drawing up the arrangements for tariffs and customs checks for goods coming from the Republic of Ireland into Northern Ireland?
We've no role in that. We were involved in the deliberations on that policy before it was adopted, and then it was announced on the 13th of March. The announcement was that the UK temporary tariff regime would not apply at the land border. Now, that's the only way in which the government can fulfil its commitments to not have a hard border, but it has direct and very difficult economic consequences.
What's your assessment?
Put into that.
What's your assessment of the smuggling consequences of this?
That could be anything that increases the scope and range of differentials, creates opportunities for smuggling. But
there's a long history of smuggling on a cross-border basis. At the moment, that is primarily in areas like fuel, alcohol and cigarettes. But as soon as you create tariffs and economic opportunities, then in, say, the agri-food sector or in other sectors economically, then you could find organised crime growing very significantly and very quickly. That depends on behaviours. It's not something that government can assess easily from the outside.
And is that an incentive for smuggling that runs through Northern Ireland, in other words, from other parts of the EU, through Ireland, through Northern Ireland, into other parts of the UK? Or is that just about smuggling across the north-south border in Ireland?
It's probably most intense on a north-south basis, but there are certainly risks more widely depending on what arrangements, and there are already some checking arrangements in place at the North Channel.
So I think people will adjust. If doors are open, people will go through them. So I think the UK policy is known and acknowledged to be temporary, not sustainable, because if it lasted a long time, then the criminals would adapt and new routes would be exploited. So what is absolutely essential is that there is work towards an agreement with the EU and with the Irish government to establish something that is sustainable and that takes you into the whole question of how the border works fully and properly on an agreed basis. The essence of the status quo is something that has agreement. It's supported by the Good Friday Agreement. Indeed, the border, in a sense, is only seen as legitimate from an Irish government or a Republican point of view based on the Good Friday Agreement. So there's a need for a new agreement that makes that strong again. If we end up in no deal, then that's a divisive thing in political and constitutional terms, and there's a need for something practical that is worked out and agreed as soon as possible after exit. No deal is absolutely not a sustainable position.
So I can see that there's all of these political challenges, but I'm actually also interested in just the technicalities, just actually what is possible in the event of no deal. I mean, if you had, I don't know, something like sugar, where there'll be tariffs from French sugar coming into Yorkshire, is there going to be an incentive under this system to take it via Dublin, via Belfast through?
So what HMRC have said is that if people change their business model and adapt to deliberately exploit the openness of the land border, the tariff would be payable. Now, what the question that begs is how and where might that be enforced? And I haven't heard any sustainable answer to that question, which is why I think the recognition from all in HMRC and the wider government system is that the model they've announced is not sustainable. It's necessary. It's a very visible and powerful political statement of no hard border, but it has practical consequences that are very difficult.
And so just in terms of the temporary system that's been announced, is your understanding then that if I was a company exporting sugar from France to Yorkshire, and I, instead of taking it through Dover, or I instead decided to take it via the Irish Republic through Northern Ireland and then across through the ports, at what stage would there be an obligation to pay a tariff at the moment if I took that route?
That obligation would kick in seeking to move the goods from Northern Ireland to Scotland. So
does that mean, therefore, there will have to be checks between Northern Ireland and Scotland, for example, on goods?
That's a logical consequence. My understanding is there aren't any plans to have such checks, but that's a matter for HMRC and the UK government to answer.
There are some checks for livestock and so on.
Yes, that's in the other direction. That's for live animals coming into Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland is a single epidemiological unit with Ireland, and that's the control of the agri-food sector and everything to do with plant, animal and human health. There's a very, very strong working between north and south in the status quo. That's one of the major underlying factors, and one that even in the recent comments by the Prime Minister there's a recognition that that's a natural thing to look at. Exactly how it plays out depends on where they settle.
So at the moment there will be a legal obligation will kick in at the point at which it moves to Scotland, to Yorkshire, but there is no current way of checking or enforcing that legal obligation.
Well, I think it's clearly easier to enforce at ports and airports than at the land border. The land border, the nature of it, there's no physical means possible by which it would be conceivable to have comprehensive checks. So I'm speaking hypothetically, and is all subject to further comment on that by UK government, and of course the SI, the statutory instruments to make these things happen, have not yet been introduced. This is all part of no deal contingency planning.
But fundamentally, no one has yet come up with a way to avoid either having checks between the Irish Republic and Northern Ireland, or between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom.
There's a third theoretical possibility, which is that there will be checks between Ireland and the rest of the EU. Now, that's clearly totally contrary to Ireland's place in the single market and would be incredibly strongly resisted. So that just put it forward as a third theoretical possibility.
And then just final question, in terms of your anticipation, going back to the issues for security and sort of smuggling incentives, you referred, Mr. May, to there being existing networks, smuggler organised crime networks and so on that can exploit this. What's the level of your concern about the expansion of some of these organised crime networks, including their relationship with dissident organisations as well, if this situation continues for some time?
So currently we assess there's around 90 organised crime groups operating in Northern Ireland, of which between a third and a half have a cross-border dimension. We also assess around a fifth of them have a connection to one or other form of paramilitary organisation. If you create the incentives to extend their operations into many new fields, depending on the nature of the no-deal arrangement, then clearly that could have very significant impacts, both in relation to the efforts being made within Northern Ireland to create what we call a culture of lawfulness, and then also in terms of funding opportunities that might be available for dissident groups as a result of serious and organised crime.
Just add a point in relation to the way this is being talked about now and the intense pressure to avoid checks at the physical border. If there's a proposal either in the deal context through the alternative arrangements work, or in a no-deal context to have checks away from the border, that may be fine and helpful to facilitate compliant traders, trusted traders, people who are wanting to ensure that their trade is legal and effective. But the larger the gap, the larger the scope for the organised crime, because
the larger the gap
between the border and the checks.
Oh, I see, the physical gap.
Yes.
Yeah.
And lots of things are being talked about as being done at some central location or on premises. But if there is no evidence of having crossed the border, what's the basis for enforcement? That's an unanswered question at the present time.
Yeah.
I would echo that. We have cross-border crime now. We have seen that the groups involved have been adaptable depending on where the demand is and where the ability to make money is. If, as a consequence of the withdrawal, the sort of 40% tariffs that will be imposed from north to south, with nothing south to north, makes it possible for groups to step into a space and make money, they will step into that space and they will make money. So I think it's highly foreseeable that the volume and scale of cross-border crime will increase. And then, of course, the links to distant Republican groups and other paramilitary groups adds a dimension to the organised crime phenomena in Northern Ireland that takes it out with the experience, for example, in the rest of Great Britain.
Do you think this is fully understood amongst those who are making the decisions?
We have certainly lost no opportunity in seeking to draw this to people's attention. I think it's harder to assess the extent to which it's fully understood.
We have good access to UK government colleagues at the present time. David Sterling, the head of the Civil Service, has written letters setting some of these points out. We're certainly doing all we can to get these messages across.
And do you have access to number 10?
Not directly, no.
The model we use to describe the situation for us, particularly in Northern Ireland, is you can't separate the economic from the social and the justice issues. If you impact one, you're going to impact the other too. So, for instance, our assessment is we have 40,000 jobs depending on exports. That doesn't include the agri-food sector. If we are to lose any significant number of jobs on an export basis, that's going to have social impact issues and consequent justice issues, and they will all play out as a single risk for us.
Unfortunately, we'll have to close the session now, but thank you very much for your time, and thank you as well for the immense amount of work and preparation that I know you and all of your teams and staff are all doing. Thank you. Order.